The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between the seed catalog and a past due notice from the feed store, and it changed the whole shape of Caleb Reyes' life before he'd even finished reading it twice. Mr. Reyes, my late husband's cousin gave me your name. I am a widow with 160 acres outside Larkspur Hollow, 3 seasons of debt, and no one left to help me work the land. I am told you are an honest man who knows cattle and isn't afraid of hard country. I cannot pay you in wages I don't have, but I can offer you a share in what the ranch becomes, if it becomes anything at all. If you are willing to ride out and see for yourself before you decide, I would be grateful. If not, I understand, and I wish you well. Abigail Marsh. There was no photograph, no florid description of herself, no promises dressed up to sound better than they were. Just a plain accounting of a hard situation from a woman who clearly hated asking for help, and had done it anyway because the alternative was worse. Caleb read it a third time at his sister's kitchen table in Cheyenne, then folded it along its worn creases. It had traveled a long way to reach him, forwarded twice by relatives who half remembered where he'd gotten to. You don't even know what she looks like, his sister said, not looking up from her mending. Could be 70. Could have a temper like a corner badger. She's not asking me to marry her, Caleb said. She's asking me to help her keep a ranch. 300 miles is a long way to go find out you misread a letter. He didn't have an answer for that. He only knew that something in the plainness of her words, the refusal to beg, the honesty about what she couldn't offer, had lodged itself in him and wouldn't come loose. He'd spent 6 years drifting between other men's outfits, working other men's cattle, saving toward a piece of ground he never seemed to reach. Here was a woman offering him a real stake in something, and asking nothing of him but honest work and the willingness to look before he leapt. He left before the week was out. The ride took 11 days. He crossed 2 rivers running high with spring melt, lost a shoe off his gelding outside a town too small to have a name on any map he carried, and spent one bad night in a line shack riding out a storm that turned the sky the color of a bruise. By the time Larkspur Hollow came into view, a scattering of buildings pressed into the fold of a valley, cottonwoods marking the line of a creek, he was saddle-sore, sun-cracked, and half convinced his sister was right and he was a fool. Then he saw the ranch. The house was small but sound, the fences mended in places with fresh cut where that hadn't grayed yet, and a woman was standing in the yard with a rifle broken open over her arm, feeding shells into it with the unhurried competence of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. She was younger than he'd braced for, 30, maybe, with sun-browned forearms and dark hair pulled back hard enough to mean business, and she watched him ride in without a flicker of the relief he might have expected from a woman who'd sent a letter 300 miles asking for rescue. "You're Reyes," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "You rode all this way on a letter with no likeness in it. You wrote it like a woman who doesn't waste words on things that aren't true. Seemed worth trusting." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but the loosening of a jaw that had been set hard for a long time. "Get down. You look like you haven't eaten since Cheyenne." The ranch was worse off than the letter had let on, and better than he'd feared. Abigail Marsh had buried her husband the autumn before, a fever that took him in 4 days after he'd survived 9 years of everything else the territory could throw at a man, and she'd spend the winter alone, stretching supplies, doctoring what stock she could, and losing a little more ground every week to debt and exhaustion and the sheer physical impossibility of one person doing a ranch's worth of work. She did not talk about her husband easily, and Caleb didn't press. But he noticed the things she'd kept running despite everything. The kitchen garden, weeded and staked. The milk cow, brushed till her coat shone. A shelf of books that had clearly been read more than once. She was not a woman waiting to be saved. She was a woman who had been holding a line by herself and had finally, at great cost of her pride, asked for reinforcements. They worked the first weeks mostly in silence, the particular silence of 2 people sizing each other up through labor rather than words, mending fence, culling a sick heifer from the herd before she could spread whatever ailed her, hauling water when the pump gave out and needed a pot neither of them could get till the next supply run. Caleb found he liked the quiet of her. She didn't fill space with talk she didn't mean. When she did speak, it mattered. "Why'd you really come?" she asked him one evening. A month in, both of them sitting on the porch step with coffee gone lukewarm in tin cups. "Told you. The letter." "That's not a reason. That's an excuse for a reason you haven't said yet." He looked at the darkening tree line a long moment. I've spent 6 years working other men's land and calling it a living. I wanted something that was mine to lose, for once, instead of something I could just walk away from with nothing to show for the years. He glanced at her. Your letter didn't promise me anything easy. Just honest. I hadn't had honest offered to me in a good while. She didn't answer that, but she didn't look away either, and something passed between them that neither one named. Summer came hard and full. They rebuilt the west fence line together, board by board, and Caleb learned the particular rhythm of Abigail's laugh, rare and worth working for, and entirely unlike the K-ful voice she used for the men from the bank who rode out twice that season to remind her what she owed. He learned that she'd grown up in Ohio and come west at 19 with a husband she'd loved steadily rather than fiercely, and that she grieved him honestly and was, slowly, coming out the other side of it. The first winter of their marriage came in hard and early, and it was nothing like the summer that had made Caleb believe the worst was behind them. It started with the cattle. A blue norther blew down out of Canada in late October, weeks before anyone in the valley expected it, and it caught nearly 40 head still up in a high pasture where they'd been fattening on the last of the summer grass. Caleb and Abigail rode out together at first light into a wind that cut through like it was nothing, and by the time they'd pushed what stock they could find down toward the home ranch, they'd lost 6 to the storm and 2 more to a ravine none of them had seen coming in the whiteout. That's near a fifth of the herd. Abigail said that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her, her handwriting gone tight and small the way it did when she was doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to. We were already thin on a note to the bank. We'll make it back next season. Caleb. She looked up at him, and there was something in her face he hadn't seen since the day he'd ridden in, the old wariness, the bracing for a blow. I need you to understand something about me before this goes further. I don't say things are fine when they aren't. I didn't do it with Thomas, and I won't do it with you. This is bad. We might lose the ranch. He sat down across from her, and instead of arguing, he asked her to walk him through the numbers, all of them, the way she hadn't quite trusted anyone to see since her first husband died. It took most of the night. What emerged wasn't hopeless, but it wasn't far from it either. A note coming due in spring, a herd too small to cover it, and a bank in the territory that had shown, twice already, that it wasn't inclined toward patience with widows or the men who married them. The next weeks were the hardest of their marriage, not because they fought, they didn't much, but because the way the things sat on both of them in different shapes. Abigail worked harder than Caleb had ever seen a person work, rationing feed, doctoring the weakened stock by lamplight, riding out in cold that should have kept anyone indoors to check on cattle that might not survive the season regardless of what she did. Caleb watched her burning herself down to nothing trying to outwork a problem that wasn't going to be solved by labor alone, and it scared him more than the storm had. You can't fix the note by working yourself sick, he told her one night, taking the lamp from her hands as she sat mending a bridle at 2 a.m. for the 3rd night running. I fixed worse before you got here. You didn't fix it. You survived it. There's a difference, and it costs you something every time. He crouched down in front of her chair, so she'd look at him instead of the bridle. I didn't ride 300 miles to watch you work yourself into ground alone. If this ranch goes under, it goes under with both of us trying everything, not you trying everything and me standing by feeling useless. She was quiet a long moment. Thomas used to tell me I carried things too heavy for one person and wouldn't hand off the weight. Thomas was right. I'm not asking you to hand it off. I'm asking you to let me carry half. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No thunderstorm this time, no rain-soaked doorway. Just a woman who'd spent years learning that asking for help got you disappointed. Sitting in a cold kitchen at 2 a.m, deciding whether to trust it one more time. She set the bridle down. All right, she said. Half. They spent December working the problem the way they'd once worked fence. Together, methodically, without wasted motion. Caleb rode 2 days to the county seat and came back not with a miracle, but with a name, a cattle buyer out of Cheyenne, who paid fair prices for lean winter beef sold ahead of the spring glut, when everyone else was holding their herds and driving the price down come April. It meant selling stock they'd hoped to keep for breeding, which meant a smaller herd going into next year, which meant an argument that lasted the better part of an evening. We sell the wrong 10 head, and we got nothing to build back with, Abigail said. We sell nothing, and we lose the whole ranch to the bank in March. A smaller herd we own beats a full herd that isn't ours anymore. In the end, it was Abigail who found the answer neither of them had considered. Not selling the young stock at all. But the two bulls Thomas had spent years breeding up animals with a bloodline reputation in the valley that made them worth more to another rancher than their weight in beef ever would. It cost her something to let them go. Caleb watched her stand at the fence the morning the buyer's men came for them, arms crossed, jaw tight, saying nothing while 8 years of her first husband's careful breeding work rode off down the valley road. But the price covered nearly a third of what they owed, and it meant the herd that remained still had a future in it. You didn't have to be the one to decide that, Caleb said afterward, finding her still at the fence an hour later. Somebody had to, and I know what those bulls were worth better than you do. She wiped her face with the back of her glove, quick, like she didn't want to see it, and knew he already had. Thomas would understand. He'd rather the land survive than the bloodline. Man built this place out of nothing. He'd want it kept. Caleb didn't say anything to that. He just stood beside her at the fence until the cold drove them both back toward the house. And something about standing there together, not fixing her grief, not talking her out of it, just being present for it, did more than any words might have. Spring came late that year, but it came. The note was paid in full the second week of March, with $11 left over that Abigail put towards seed for a bigger kitchen garden. Because a person ought to have something growing that isn't owed to a bank. The herd was smaller than it had been, but it was healthy, and it was theirs outright for the first time since Thomas had first taken out the loan against the land nearly a decade before. They stood at the same fence line where they'd married the spring before, looking out over pasture just starting to green, and Caleb found himself thinking about the letter that had started all of it, the plain, unadorned honesty of a woman who hadn't promised him anything easy.